Our gospel lesson today is from the 7th chapter of Luke. It's the 11th to the 17th verses. Hear this amazing word of God. Soon afterward, Jesus went to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. And as he drew near to the gate of the city, behold, a man who had died was being carried out. It was the only son of his mother. She was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and he said to her, "Oh, do not weep." And he came and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And the dead man sat up. He began to speak, and he gave him to his mother. Well, fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report concerning him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. God's blessings be on the reading of his most holy word. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. I've entitled today's sermon, "When Life is Unfair." Now, it's a dramatic scene when you think about it. I mean, a funeral procession is halted and the trip to the cemetery interrupted. Of course, it was not anything like our funerals today. We don't have a black Cadillac hearse. We don't have a series of black Cadillac limousines and lots of cars trailing to the cemetery. No, this was a very primitive scene. It was very personal. There was no city traffic to contend with. There were no indifferent motorists. No, this was a village scene. These people, they are on foot. They're following the widowed mother who is following professional mourners, and they're crying, and they're banging cymbals, and they're playing flutes, and they're screaming in high-pitched shrieking, and they're wailing. Now, this is a Palestinian village called Nain. It's just a short distance from Nazareth, which is, of course, Jesus' hometown. It's a day's walk from Capernaum, which is Jesus' now adopted town. The pallbearers are carrying the body of a young man in a long wicker basket. It's covered with a huge shroud, and they were going to bury him outside the city because, except for the very important people, ancient Jews always buried their dead outside the city, usually on the day of death or the next day. And embalming was not practiced, especially in that heat. For modern and different eyes, the scene was dramatic enough by itself. Think of it. He was the dead son of his mother, and she was a widow. Now, the pathos and the sorrow of the ages is contained in that statement because in a patriarchal society, orphans and widows, like his mother, were regarded as vulnerable. They were weak and without much opportunity for economic support. A great crowd followed the procession, indicating sympathy and compassion, at least for the time being. We all know when life is unfair. All you have to do is pick up a daily newspaper. There are tragic stories of premature deaths, fractured relationships, broken dreams. Indeed, we need not turn to any newspaper for the accounting of our world's troubles and sorrows. We have only to look at our own friends, our neighbors, and our families. We have only to look into our own lives and our own hearts. And Jesus, the healer and the power giver, he never insulted people by telling them that their problems weren't real. He never told the sick they were never really sick or that their illness had no pain or reality. He never told people that death wasn't real. Nor did he offer this widow mother this Pollyannish pabulum to soothe her grieving heart. But what Jesus does in the midst of this large crowd, and this large crowd of caring people, may I add, he does more. Now, Jesus is on the way home from Capernaum. He's going to Nazareth in that direction. And he had just healed this Roman centurion slave. And he sees this poor widowed mother. He senses the situation, and this becomes a justice issue. Do not weep, he told her. Her tears for her son are intermingling no less than with the endless salty tears that she shed for her husband. And in the continuing drama, risking ceremonial impurity, Jesus reaches out. He touches the bier containing the dead body, which was a no-no. He looks at the carefully wrapped corpse. And then he says, "Young man, I say, get up." He doesn't wrestle in prayer with his Father. He doesn't struggle in deep spiritual warfare. He commands the corpse to just get up. And his command reverses the powers of darkness and death. He turns a funeral procession into a family reunion. What a remarkable experience. You know, as a minister of the gospel, I have attended a lot of funerals. In fact, I just buried Wednesday the third member of a family who had attended here for many years. I was given the great opportunity of offering comfort and sympathy and support and hope based on the glorious gospel of salvation in Jesus Christ. But there is in these moments sometimes a feeling of impotence. I can offer hope for the future, but I cannot reverse what has happened in the immediate past. I can offer comfort for the present, but I cannot fill the gap that has been left in people's lives. But at this point in the story, Jesus could. Jesus can. Jesus will. Reformed faith teaches us that there are four sources of evil in our world, and one of them is not death, because death is as much part of life and living as life itself. It's the fear of death. You know, I was reading about Alfred Krupp. He was a famous munitions maker. Oddly, he was the agent of death and massive killing in World War II. He supplied the Nazi war machine with the ability to destroy half of Europe. But he himself lived in constant fear of death. Everyone in his company was strictly forbidden to refer to the subject of death in conversation. And when a relative of his own wife's died in his house, he ran from the house and he separated from his wife and never spoke to her. He was so enraged. And finally, at his deathbed during his last sickness, he offered his doctor $1 million to prolong his life. But of course, that's impossible, isn't it? You know, death sometimes has real power. Money and prestige and position aren't going to change any of that. Visits and phone calls and sympathy cards aren't going to change that. Preachers and churches and expensive funerals aren't going to change that. But Jesus can. Jesus did. And Jesus will. Now, we see this story the same as we did with the story of Lazarus. Because for Martha and Mary, their brother, and for this widow at Nain, there are three distinct possibilities here. The first statement we want to make is that Jesus makes a clear statement that God can and will reverse death. He can do that. Two, he does it through his agent Jesus Christ to show us that fact in the very resurrection from death of this widow's son and Lazarus. And three, the best part is there's hope for you and for me when it's our turn in the lane. There is great hope for us when our eyes are closed and we go on to the next step of the journey. The story of this widow's son is not only about restoration in the present, but think about the hope for the future. And somebody said to me one day, why does God allow Jesus to intervene with the forces of nature and alter them to give life to what has obviously run its course? And my answer is because God loves us that much. You know, I'm reminded of a friend of mine years ago living in Indiana. They have a lot of tornadoes in Indiana. His young son had a special fear of storms. And one day, when a storm threatened, the father took his son out to the front of their lovely, substantial home. He pointed around the neighborhood. He said, see this, son? He says, everything's okay. These are solid homes, and we are safe, and we are dry in them. Shortly, right at that time, a tornado touched down the block away and utterly destroyed all the houses on the block. The storms of the natural world are real, just as the storms of the spiritual, psychological world. Trouble and tragedy are real. Evil and death are real. Jesus never said to the disciples on the stormy Sea of Galilee, oh, there's no storm. The storm is in your mind. He never said that. Instead, what he said was, peace, be still. And it was. You may be sitting here and you may be worrying about your job. You may be sitting here and you may be worrying about your home declining in value. You may be sitting here worrying about your financial resources dwindling. You may be worrying about a serious illness. You may be worrying about your relationships. You may be worrying about your children. You may be enslaved to a difficult habit you can't break. Well, Jesus says, don't deny it. The widow never said her son was dead. Wasn't dead. But she believed in the saving grace of God. You know, years ago, a man was traveling by ship with his young daughter across the ocean. And it was a very difficult time because he was recently widowed. And he was standing against the rail of the ship when his daughter asked him if God loved them as much as they had loved her late mother. Of course he does, the man replied to the little girl. There's absolutely nothing bigger or more powerful and all-consuming than God's love for us. And the little girl wanted to know exactly how big is God's love. Finally, her father looked at her with tenderness and said, well, look across the sea as far as you can. God's love stretches around to cover all of that, above the blue sky and deeper than the deepest part of the ocean underneath it. And the little girl pondered about that for a minute, and she looked at her dad and she said, and to think, Daddy, we're standing right in the middle of it. And we are. We are right in the middle of God's love. And we don't need this miracle story to tell us that. Most of you, most of us, and I include myself, have known God's love all of our lives. I know what personal tragedy is. But I never once doubted, that God wasn't present in my life. Not once. Miracles do occur. They do, to the eyes of faith. Yes, life can be unfair. This is the best of times, but it's also the worst of times for some, to quote Mr. Dickens. Death in one form or another is all around us, but so is the saving grace of God, if we only believe it. Whatever it is in your life, whatever powers of darkness have a grip on you, there is hope for you. There is new life. Do not weep, Jesus tells us today. Get up! The powers of darkness are overcome, and we are promised life and love and hope for a better day. To the glory of God.